Well, welcome everybody on this rather rainy, kind of gloomy Saturday morning. It's nice to see you all here today. And I just want to welcome all of you. I want to welcome in particular our board members who are here today. Board members, where are you? Our board members, and we have all leagues represented here today. Ames, Story County. We have BlackHawk-Bremer. Dubuque, they're coming. They're just late. Grinnell, Jasper County, Bonnie, Johnson County, Lynn County, Metro Des Moines, Muscatine. Oh, there was somebody coming. She's maybe not here yet, but I know she's coming. We have Ottumwa. She's supposed to be here. Maybe there's late. Sioux City is here. And then who else are we missing? Davenport, yes. Our member at large is, she's registered. I don't see her here yet, but maybe so. All right. I'm going to turn this over very quickly to Amy, who's right here, Amy Campbell and Craig Patterson, and our special guest, Senator Carrie Kolker and Representative Heather Mattson will be here about 10:30 for our panel, but they're going to talk to us about our priorities for this year.
Hey everyone, hola, buenos dias. Oh, it's been a long time since I had my Spanish class, but thank you guys for coming. This is great, especially since it's the University of Iowa's homecoming day. So I'm glad we still had terrific turnout. I'm sorry for my voice. I didn't have one earlier this week, so I'm glad that at least I can speak to you. But I wanted to go over the issues briefing. We kind of did this a little different this year. Since we had a really good program for the afternoon on diversity and equality, we decided to kind of go away from kind of diving in deeply to an issue to having a legislative panel speak to us. So I'm really excited about our speakers, but I wanted to take a few minutes to go over what our priorities are. And this is going to look very familiar to you since we decided to do a 2-year legislative agenda to kind of follow the General Assembly, understanding it takes a long time to get a bill passed in the legislature. So, but there were a few additions. So I wanted to quickly go through these, and then if you guys had questions or wanted to talk about something in particular, we'll have a little time to do that. I also want to make a note that we are on Facebook Live, thanks to the Dargans. Appreciate them doing this. Also, if anybody's tuning in, and I'll say this a couple times, if people have questions that are watching this on Facebook Live, they can post those in the comments, and Sherry Dargan will write them down and we'll be able to ask them. So they go to the BlackHawk-Bremer Facebook page, League Facebook page on Facebook. So again, we'll make note of that if people join a little bit later, but Craig will be then the person asking the Facebook Live questions for our panel or for this part. So again, our top priority is going to be trying to work with the governor's office again to get restoration of voting rights for those who have been convicted of a felony. It's been a long-standing priority of the League. We made really the issue became elevated because of Governor Reynolds' support for that, and she again was pressuring the legislature to do that. I have every belief that it will be on her legislative agenda again this year. As you know, a constitutional amendment takes a lot of time, so it's really important to get it passed this year. Our issue with this is I'll just be honest, the Senate. I apologize, I should not wear that when I'm coughing. But the Senate Republicans in particular, there's just not the votes in that caucus. The House has the votes and is willing to pass it. at least the makeup of the legislature last year it was bipartisan. The Senate Republican caucus is deeply divided on this, mainly around the issue of who gets to have their rights restored. They're stuck on sex offenders. They're stuck on people that have not paid back all of their fees and fines, which can be extremely difficult for a person coming out of prison. They're not getting the $200,000 check jobs. If they are, they're lucky. So it's difficult to get all of those paid off, even in a lifetime. The governor's proposal doesn't put caveats on that, and we have repeatedly suggested that if they are going to do something about defining who is worthy of that, they do that in law, not in constitution. That means if they do it this year, then we have a chance of changing that in the future if it's in law. So as you know, the constitutional change is more difficult. So we want a clean constitutional amendment passed. Iowa's redistricting process is always going to be something that we will fight to keep and maintain. We don't have the games that are played in other states. Iowa's redistricting process is a model. And Teresa has been going around and meeting with leadership to talk about this. And she had some good news this week when Senator Charles Schneider's staff person called her. He's been extremely busy in his other job at principal, so he wasn't able to meet with her, but wanted to assure her that he is on the record in support of maintaining Iowa's redistricting process. So he is the president of the Senate. I have heard repeatedly from Chris Hagnow, who used to be the majority leader, that he would not change that, but he is no longer the majority leader. We have a new majority leader, so we'll have to discuss those but really Craig and I have heard nobody talking about changing Iowa's redistricting process. So we'll all remain vigilant on this. And certainly if anybody hears anybody kind of saying, well, but in their conversations with legislators, let us know. I'm going to turn it over to Craig to talk about the environmental side of our priorities. As you know, we've fought for water quality for many years. We've been supportive of the I Will proposal, in particular that formula which gives additional dollars to REAP, to trails and other priorities. So I wanted to let Craig talk a second about that.
Yeah, and not a whole lot to add to that. Just, there's basically with the effort to increase the state sales tax by the 3/8 cents in order to fund the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. There's really two issues. There's the formula of how those funds will be disseminated out, and then there's the issue of actually getting the legislature to vote on the sales tax increase. I can tell you, and Amy and I work with a bunch of different organizations that are all really kind of focused on this effort. In particular, the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is an organization that we work a lot with, along with county conservation boards. And there has been a lot of focus in the last few months, in particular, on sitting down and trying to figure out how to get the formula right. So that everybody can kind of live with whatever's passed. There's a bunch of different people there was a formula that was in place when the legislature first, when the legislature and the voters first approved I Will, but it was really a template at the time for how they thought the money should be divvied up. And there's been some organizations that really don't like the way that formula works, and have said if it moves forward, they want to see some of these numbers kind of move around a little bit. I know REAP is a piece of that formula. I think REAP getting REAP fully funded has never really been in question. I think getting that to $20 million is definitely a priority. But the other pieces, as far as how the trails work out, local conservation partnerships, things like that, how to fund the water quality bill that passed the legislature 2 years ago, Senate File 512. That's another piece that the legislature really wants to try to get that worked out. So there's been a lot of work around that formula over the last couple of months, and I think they're zeroing in on some potential changes that they can all live with. If they can get that nailed down, then I think you'll see the legislature taking a serious look at trying to take on the sales tax increase in the upcoming session. So the best thing that we can do is just keep our foot on the gas pedal and try to keep making the case that, we want to see this passed, and let the folks that are really kind of in the kitchen on that, trying to figure out the recipe, to keep doing their magic. But I think there is definitely an opening. There'll be a whole different argument about whether to increase the sales tax by 3/8 of a cent or the full penny, and what, the rest, that those other 5/8 will be used for, and that's kind of, that's going to be one of those things that, Amy and a bunch of other folks are going to be looking at. Mental health is a potential piece of that. So that's a whole different discussion. But I do think there is an opening to, for the Republicans in the legislature and the governor to potentially push for I will this year, if we can keep our fingers crossed and keep pushing.
It's all about positioning, right? So one of our agenda items continues to be regional mental health disability services funding. As you know, we passed some sweeping legislation that set core services for adults and children now. There's a lot of issues involved in that, workforce issues, payment issues, all of that. But really the core is that property taxes don't cover the costs. So there's going to need to be some supplemental dollars in that. And the one place that we're all looking, of course, is the rest of that 1 cent sales tax, whether it's a 1 cent sales tax or a portion of a penny. There's some concerns in the Senate where you have the vice chairs from the Council Bluffs area, and if you're near Nebraska, 1 cent puts you over the sales tax in Nebraska. So there will be many challenges with that. We've also heard, we've also heard that there is, the Senate may be considering a grand tax plan. So that could factor into that if they're shifting dollars away from property taxes. So really, when it comes to when it comes to mental health funding, these will be things we'll be watching with whatever happens in the tax structure, because there might be an opening to do that. Bottle bill, lots of bills recently to try to dismantle Iowa's bottle redemption law. Our biggest champion on the Republican side in the House was Representative Andy McKean, who is now a Democrat. I'm a little worried about repercussions of that switch, and that they might directly go after the bottle bill issue. So I am worried this year about the bottle bill. There are a lot of proposals out there. I can't remember. Do you remember what they called it? The drop, Craig? Oh, he's talking. The dropping. Do you remember what they called the alternative to the bottle bill? Something in drop site. Drop it. Oh, well, there. I got the drop part. I forgot the it part. Drop it. Where you would have bottle redemption centers that you, maybe in a grocery store's parking lot, that you could just drop your bottles off there, and cans. Of course, the problem is how much of that goes to the recyclers. So that there's just a lot of issues with that. We're going to have to be diligent on the bottle bill this year. Always, we will be supporting access to reproductive health services for women. I'm not sure there's much else that they can do in that aspect, although I say that every year and they come up with something. So we'll be watching that. But the governor will be proposing again her over-the-counter contraceptive bill. To quote her, when we had a meeting with her staff, she said, the number one cause of abortion is unintended pregnancy. So we need to help alleviate and stop unintended pregnancies. so making contraceptives more widely available. She faces challenges within her own caucus on this. So it will again be a challenge, but I know that the House, the Senate did pass it this year. So the problem was in the House on this one. Oh, it's a good thing I'm not talking more today. So Medicaid, we will always be diligent to watch what's going on with Medicaid. As you know, we have another MCO on staff, so on board. So we will be continuing to watch as that unfolds. That's kind of a placeholder in our agenda, along with funding for education, preschool, childcare assistance may come up as an issue this year as people try to look at what to do about the cliff so that people can take job promotions without fear of losing their childcare assistance, to have some type of a phase out so that there is not just a sudden you're off childcare. We all know that childcare is expensive, and that's a huge issue for families in trying to secure safe, affordable, available childcare throughout the state. And that is a United Way priority too. So we work a lot with United Ways on that. Again, our juvenile and criminal justice group will be looking at making sure of eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, that we don't add more mandatory minimums, penalty enhancements, judicial flexibility. That's kind of a whole, covers all the stuff that Karen and her group do on that. Human trafficking, again, I don't know of any agenda items being promoted on that, but that is something that we will continue to look at, and that involves both sex and labor trafficking. Sometimes people forget about the labor trafficking part, which is a huge issue as well in Iowa. We will again oppose the reinstatement of the death penalty. I don't see that coming up as an issue this year, but you never know. There'll probably be a bill filed. Enact gun safety laws. Every year, I think there's another focusing event that's going to get us to that point where we'll pass some gun safety laws, and then it never happens. And really, honestly, that day I was driving down to the Ottumwa League, and I was the day after the Newtown shooting, and I couldn't hold myself together. Cried the whole way down there because my kids were in the same grade as those kids that were killed. But, I continue to look at these red flag laws that we're talking about nationally, and the fact that we got rid of our red flag law a few years ago. It's kind of ironic. But again, we will continue to look at that. But I will remind everybody that our new majority leader, Representative Matt Winchittle, is the champion of gun liberalization laws. So we will most likely have a gun law on the ballot. It just depends on how quickly they can get all of that passed and if they can do it again next year. And that one is strict scrutiny, so it's even goes further than our U.S. Constitution. I'll just leave it at that. We added supporting adoption of state strategies to address climate change. We really don't have anything to promote on that. That's more of a national issue. But again, if things come up or there's things that we can do within the Iowa legislature to start to address climate change, we would support those. And then making Iowa a welcoming place for refugees and immigrants. Actually, one of our speakers is on the International Relations Committee, who has been doing a lot of work around the refugee resettlement stuff. They had hearings on that this last year. And I think there is a lot of communities that would like to welcome refugees and immigrants to their communities as a growth strategy and as a workforce strategy. But, there's not a lot Iowa can do when you have a president who is lowering the numbers allowed into the country of refugees. Not even just talking about the immigrants, but the refugees that are coming in from Syria or Cambodia or some other Burma. So there is a lot of things on our agenda. We have about 10 minutes if you want to have some questions before we move on with what's on our agenda. Yes, either one of you.
Could you talk a little bit more about the strict scrutiny part of gun laws?
So if Craig were here, he'd be the one that could do more of that. But my understanding is it's a higher judicial standard for how they look at a law. So it's harder for them to overturn it. Is there somebody that can explain that better than that? Strict scrutiny. It's just it's much like, you know, your evidence of proof that you have various levels of burden of proof in the judicial system. I think it's kind of the court's way of saying you have a higher bar to show that you're violating rules or rights than anything else. So it's my understanding.
Mine is a good question too. If you knowing what you do about that incident, do you think how probable do you think it is that he could walk in the lead for this significant
I honestly can't think of anything else other than this constitutional amendment that they would be looking at. Can you, Craig?
We have 9-year-olds.
Yes, or toddlers, but yeah. No age limit, yeah. Sorry.
I think everybody needs to know that he owns a gun business. His family owns a gun business.
He is a gunsmith too, yeah.
He's a gunsmith. So he's going to push, he was pushing it when I was serving in the White House. He'll continue to push it.
Yeah, I honestly, we've done so much with getting rid of anything we already had in law that I'm not sure what else he can do other than this constitutional amendment at this time. So, yeah, I don't see anything more. I don't see anything positive on trying to get some more, like the red flag law allowed back in, where a county, we used to have a law that the county, the police or the county sheriff could, if somebody's known to them as somebody that's been lots of calls to their house for domestic incidents, or they are constantly getting in bar fights, and you know, if there's somebody that they know or somebody who's been in and out of psychiatric placements and in their jail and having to get mental health evaluations, a lot of they know those people in their community, and it's one of those ways they can say no to a gun license. Yes, Teresa?
Has there been any connection to the suicide rates made to them because our suicide rates is going up 36% in 1 year?
Teresa, oh,
And then if you look at the percentage of people who use guns to kill themselves, it's really quite high.
I need to ask the Dargans. Do I need to repeat the question, do you think, or do you think you can hear? Okay. All right. We might, with the panel, we'll have one of these out and around to mic you when you have a question so that everybody can hear. But the question is about the connection to guns and suicide rates. No, they haven't been using the connection as haven't been discussing that. People like you, Teresa, come to the Capitol with NAMI Greater Des Moines and remind them of that. But that's the only time I've ever heard really anybody at the Capitol talking about the connection to suicide rates is in the advocacy part, or in some of our friends in the Capitol that are elected who support gun safety laws. Have mentioned that, but it's not permeated, I guess I would say.
I was going to say that the other thing that happened when he was pushing so much gun legislation, I asked whether or not I sent email to Chris Agnew or the leadership, and I said, isn't there something conflict of interest that the guy is pushing on the legislation benefits variety from everything that he is passing, since he becomes and all the gun shop?
Well, and I don't think he actually owns, it's his family that owns it. And he no longer is a practicing gunsmith. He works for the Union Pacific, but that's probably the issue. So she asked about conflicts of interest. So he's not actually employed, I don't think, as that anymore. It'd be similar to a former retired teacher voting on, educational funding, I would guess. But Mary Ray.
I'm wondering, Amy, if you can provide us, as the legislative session develops, with the names of lawmakers in Mr. Winchell, I don't know that name, but Mr. Winchell party would be willing to listen to those who would like to find maybe some kind of better understanding than.
Sure. Mary Ray asked if I could identify some Republicans who would be interested in talking about gun safety, and I can do that. I want to just mention to people that Matt Winchell and I are actually good friends, and he sat down and talked to me for 3 hours about gun rights one day in the House lounge. So he himself is always willing to talk to people on the other side of that issue. He likes good debate. He likes it as an intellectual interest as well as the issue himself. He likes to share why he feels that way. He is raising 2 young girls, and they're at home alone on the farm with his wife. And so he wants his kids to know how to defend their home as well. So it is interesting when you do have those positive dialogues, and I think that's what the league's all about. We want to have these conversations and have them based on fact, there is a philosophical point in this, but, and there's a lot of discussion about the constitutional issues of it. So he's willing to have those. So I would encourage, I guess, when we have our Capitol Day, which is on March, I don't have my calendar right in front of me. 20th? Hold on. It is March 11th. On March 11th, maybe we can have a little group of you go in and meet with them to talk about that. Karen, you're our last question because we have our panelists here. So,
With the shakeup at DHS and everything that's gone on there, as well as the whole, it seems like a scandal on the privatization of Medicaid. What do you see happening with Medicaid in the next year? Any thoughts?
Nothing. We have a new director coming in at DHS. I have had clients check up on her, and so far everybody has said she's really good to work with. So it'll be interesting. They've I'm sorry. They've checked in with their counterparts in Texas. She comes from Texas. So it'll be interesting to see what she brings to the table. I think there's a funding component that will be addressed. I'm not sure how much. There are some legislators that are interested in looking at, Republican legislators that are looking at what rates are just not sustainable for providers and how they get them up. There's money. As we all saw, we ended the state with some $200 million plus of reserves going into reserves. So far, our numbers are looking good, but I would expect caution because who knows what this trade war is going to do. All this flooding, more rain. I think Craig said his deck guy was upset because normally they have about 13 inches of rain and they've had 40 so far this year. So he can't even get out to do people's decks. So I apologize. So I think we'll end with that and then we'll have our panelists come up here. I'm going to get a drink of water and then we'll introduce them if they want to kind of come up here. Oh my goodness. The more I talk, the worse it gets. So if anybody needs to get another cup of coffee.
Oh, guys.
Well, why don't you get yourself some? Oh my gosh.
Sherry wanted me to see if you wanted lemon drops. Those will help you.
Maybe. Lemon drops. I think it's passed already. It's passed both chambers. Which one's no, voting rights? No, I think I meant those down. Sorry. No. Voting rights. No, house, yes. Maybe not. See, I'm glad this is going to be me too. I'm going to check on it here.
I remember being in the committee, and I remember I came out of the committee.
The Senate, but I can't remember. Karen, do you remember who house has the voting restoration? The House by an overwhelming majority has the.
Now I'm suddenly remembering Bobby Coleman talking about it. Yes.
The Senate was. We get on it. It was like 98-2 or
Yes.
something like
Yes.
that.
Thank you.
It was a huge majority.
Now it's coming back.
Well, I forget these things until I have to remember them. So.
Okay, I'll work on that if you work for the over-the-counter birth control.
Yeah, I still have a point.
Okay, so I'm working on your people over there too.
Right. Actually, I know I wrote a big op-ed thing on it, so. You guys will have to share this.
We'll see if we need it.
Yeah, actually, because they're live streaming.
Oh, okay, please pass it back to her. We'll sit nice and tight. Tighten it up. All right.
Sorry for anything.
Hey, I wanted to, first of all, I've not been chair of that committee.
I was like, I just
Now learned this committee for like last year. Also, I was told to tell you that Phyllis Franklin would like you to call her. She said she's been calling. She has not. She called yesterday at 4:29 p.m. She's been trying to get us in. I have not had one message. All right now. Well, I just have to give you.
But I will, but it was last night at 4:30, and I'm like, I need to go.
No, the chamber was very gently and Holly and Robert, but Rick were there. And I couldn't look at
All right, we're gonna get back.
Well, yeah, because he said he just doesn't.
Right. All right, we're going to get started again if everybody wants to move back around. Thank you all for mints and lemon drops and everything. I hopefully will. The more I talk, the more I cough. Not contagious. It started off as allergies, and then it became whatever crud I have every League of Women Voters issues briefing. October is a tough month for me. But before I introduced our panel, I wanted to make a comment about, as Teresa and I were talking earlier, I'm not going to name names, but apparently there was a gentleman who made a comment about 2 women panelists. And we couldn't tell if it was a joke or not. But then I wanted to make a comment that since we've been working with you, I look back to 2009, and we have had 6 male elected officials speak to us and 0 women. So I think it's about time that the League of Women Voters have a couple women. I also want to say that these 2 women are incredible. I'm just going to tell you, Craig and I have had the fortune of working with these 2 before they were elected. And what unites us is really stronger than what divides us, because they come from 2 different philosophical origins. but they both have this go-to attitude. They are both incredibly smart. They're incredibly energetic. They're willing to challenge people within their own parties to do what's right. And it's just been a joy to work with them. They also are both parents of twins. And I have twins, of course. Mine are now in 3rd grade. Yes, it's the twindom.
Don't drink the water today.
Carrie's are a little older. She's got a boy and a girl, and Heather has a boy and a girl. I have 2 girls, but that's really why I invited them. No. Also, Senator Carrie Kelker was on the tourism board that we have been lobbyists with since we left our other company, the Travel Federation of Iowa. So we've known her for a number of years. And then Heather, when she decided to start her own consulting business and stay at home with her twins, after working for a number of places, she was our bill tracker. So that bill tracker that you guys all look at was Heather's writing for 5 years. So we have a lot of connections with these two, but also they came in at the same time as new legislators in that sort of wave of new women that were elected. And so I wanted to give a brief background, although that was probably enough for them. But as I mentioned, Senator Kelker, I'm still getting used to saying Senator Kelker. And she would probably be fine if I called her Carrie. But she has been working with the Travel Federation of Iowa, their Eastern Iowa region, tourism region. She also worked for the Dubuque Chamber of Commerce, Convention and Visitors Bureau. I have this right before me. I could actually just read this. She's a part of the Dyersville Area Community Foundation on the board of the Destination Marketing Alliance, the Travel Federation of Iowa, and the Beckman High School Booster Club. And she has, I didn't know you grew up in Stanton though, near Red Oak, if anyone knows that area. I learned so much just Googling her. She also is vice chair of the Commerce Committee, which does a lot of the insurance and regulation business issues in the Senate. She's on appropriations, labor and business relations, transportation, veterans affairs, and she's on the education appropriations subcommittee. She also sits on the Enhance Iowa Board, Iowa Finance Authority Board, and the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. Representative Heather Matson is actually not from Iowa. She became an Iowan when her husband came to school here. He's a physician at Broadlawns. And so did you go to DMU? DMU. She has a BA in government from Western New England College in Springfield, Massachusetts, and an MA in legislative affairs from George Washington University in DC. I already mentioned she has twins and also worked on campaigns for Leonard Boswell, Dusky Terry, former Governor Tom Vilsack, and then Senator John Kerry. And she's worked on issue advocacy at the Chicago, sorry, I didn't mean to stumble over yours, Chicago Mercantile Exchange and Planned Parenthood, which is when we first met her. She was the development director at the Des Moines Social Club, which you'll remember they did a fun caucus event with beers, kind of learning how to do caucusing with beers, and worked for Pampered Chef and us. She does a lot of volunteer organizations, including the Interfaith Alliance, where she was or is vice chair of the board of directors. And she sits on the Economic Growth Committee, Education Committee, Environmental Protection, Human Resources, and the Economic Development Appropriations Subcommittee. She's also on the International Affairs Committee, which I mentioned had some hearings this year on refugee resettlement that goes on with Catholic Charities and Lutheran Services in Iowa, and are very interested in that. Senator Nunn from the Bondurant area is really interested in immigration and refugee issues. She also sits on the School Finance Formula Review Committee. That sounds fascinating. And the Medical Assistance Advisory Committee, also known as the MAC. And that is about every provider group is represented on that. There's like they're no longer members. They've shortened up the memberships to have an executive committee that runs everything, but there's like 90 some people that were a member of that group, and they do all of the review and oversight of the Medicaid program. So with that, I'm going to let them each talk a little bit. I didn't give them much guidance on what to talk about. I'm kind of let them talk about what they're seeing for the future, and a little bit about themselves that I missed or was mischaracterized, and then we'll go to questions. If you would raise your hand, again, I'm going to say for our Facebook Live folks that couldn't make it in, just put your questions in the comment field at the BlackHawk-Bremer League Facebook page, and we will read those off if you have questions that come from that. But give me time to run over, and we have to mic you so that the people on Facebook Live can actually see this as well. So I will let you guys do your intros, and then we'll get right to questions. And thank you guys so much for being here.
All right. Ooh. All right. We'll adjust this. Bear with me. So good morning. Thanks for taking time out of your day to be here. And thanks to Craig and Amy for inviting us to be here. And Heather and I were just talking outside. We haven't seen each other a whole lot since session. And everyone thinks that when we're at the Capitol, we see each other all the time. But really, that's not the case. We're in separate chambers. So we might be relying on each other for questions and answers and answer that today. But we survived our first year. We're both freshmen and we both survived it. And we'll talk about that experience a little bit as well. As Amy said, my name is Carrie Kelker. I live in Dyersville, Iowa. This was my first session. For the past 19 years, I've been working and promoting Iowa as a great place to live, work, and travel. And prior to that, I worked 6.5 years at the Dubuque Chamber of Commerce Convention Visitors Bureau. So my job has been leveraging private-public partnerships, as well as inviting people to live here, build their business here, and travel Iowa, fall in love with Iowa, and stay here so they want to raise their family. And my district is 42 rural communities. So it's very rural. It's up in Northeast Iowa. As I travel Northeast Iowa, was concerned about rural Iowa, the needs and how things were getting met. The downtowns were being abandoned. They were falling apart. And then I come into the wonderful cities like Dubuque and Des Moines and all these other places, but we all make up Iowa. We're 99 counties strong. And so I was really concerned about the abandonment, or what I felt like, the concerns out in rural Iowa for the people and the places of Iowa, because that's what I love, is the people and places. Policy, I'm getting used to a little bit. But so I want my 4 children to be able to have the opportunity to live, work, and travel Iowa as well. So that's where I ran for Senate. It was not an easy campaign at all. In fact, it was probably very brutal, and I wasn't expecting that. I've been running meetings for 20 some years. I've never divided people by eye color, by party, by religion. And so that's been probably the biggest challenge that I noticed this year was the bipartisan extreme lines that happens once in a while. And sometimes about 90% of the business that happens at the Capitol, we don't hear, is all bipartisan. And so it's the other small percentage that everyone hears about and makes a big mole pile out of. And that's okay, because we all have different opinions and we all have different beliefs. And we need to respect that. And that's why the world is the way that it is. And so we probably are going to bring some good, solid views to you today. And we're happy to answer questions. And we're here to listen to you. So I'm not going to take up much more time. But I am the proud mother of 4. I have a 23-year-old, a 21-year-old, and then my twins are 15. 3 boys and a girl. And I will tell you, my children are all different. They're tight as heck, but they're all different in their own unique way. My oldest son finally decided he's going to get into the trades. And my second son is going to a 4-year college. So I'm a big promoter of community colleges. I'm a big promoter of trades because I am a community college graduate and I have a 2-year degree and I went for a trade as well. So if you visit me on the Capitol or if you listen to my messaging, you'll notice that I'm a big supporter of those, not just 4-year colleges, but all the way around. So I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about that as well. And my freshmen are sophomores, so that verdict is out on them. So we'll see what they do. But I'm going to turn it over to Heather. And I just think it's good for you guys to get to know that we're real people. And all of you could be senators and representatives as well. And we're just normal Iowans trying to step up and help the system. And when we're done, somebody else can do it.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. So thank you so much for having us. And I think Carrie agrees with me. Like, I love serving on panels like this, just because it's so great to get a chance to interact with folks and get questions from people all over the state, because I think it's so easy to get caught up in your own community bubble and not have a sense of how people are feeling in different communities from different viewpoints, whether it's across the political spectrum or just, geographically where you are in the state. And so thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to learn from you guys. So as Amy said, my name's Heather Matson, and I represent House District 38, which is in Polk County. It is the south side of the city of Ankeny, as well as Saylor Township and some other parts of unincorporated Polk County, and one precinct of Des Moines on the east side. It's a really weird shape, but those are districts. But my district, I like to think of as pretty much a microcosm of the state. It is very evenly divided. It's about a third, a third, a third on party registration, just like the state as a whole. It's a good mix of a suburb as well as unincorporated Polk County is really hard to describe, just in terms of like how it's laid out. But believe it or not, I do have a tiny little, what someone might consider rural part of my district, even though I'm basically a suburb. Delaware Township does have farms. So there is a teeny tiny amount. But the district also goes almost to Altoona and then almost to Polk City. So that's basically it in a nutshell. And yes, I ran, actually I first ran in 2016 and lost by 1,500 votes, and then decided to run again in 2018 and won by 500 votes. And I think it just goes to show that sometimes you have to do things more than once. And sometimes, and I think this is especially true of women, unfortunately, that we tend to take things personally if they don't work out the first time and make an assumption that it's, oh, someone doesn't like me personally, or this is really all about me, and maybe there, is a much bigger issue at hand. And so one of the things that was important to me is grit. And it's making sure that you don't give up, and it's making sure that that you're putting out a strong foundation, for your kids too, and showing that, that you don't give up, right? And so that was a big part of my decision to run again, and incredibly proud and excited that it worked out the second time. So very excited to serve in the House, and I feel grateful every day that I get that opportunity. So my focus has been on education. I do serve on the education committee, having two kids in public schools. They are now in 4th grade. It's really important to me in making sure that all of our kids, no matter where they live in the state, have equal access to opportunity, making sure that our schools are adequately funded, equitably funded, done so on a timely basis. All of these things are incredibly important, not only for the kids who are in school right now, but just thinking about each of these school districts and making sure that they are going to be vital for generations to come. So important. I also serve on human resources. That was my first ask for a committee because healthcare is incredibly important to me, whether we're talking about Medicaid or women's reproductive rights. That's incredibly important for the future of this state and for everyone. Mental health care, really important to me. That's something that I heard about constantly when I was knocking doors, that the access wasn't there and the services aren't there. I'm glad to see that we made some movement forward on getting a children's mental health program off the ground. Granted, it's a structures bill, excuse me, and there's no real funding there. So making sure that we have funding moving forward in this next legislative session is something that we need to really focus on. Another issue that's really important to me that falls under human resources is childcare. We have childcare deserts across this state. And I mean, I think it was in the town of Iowa Falls, they lost their one childcare facility. The closest one is about 20 miles away. That's unacceptable. It's unacceptable from a workforce perspective, but it's also just fundamentally unacceptable when we think about how families need this, right, to be able to be out working, for mothers and fathers to be able to live their best lives and take care of their families. So I think that's something that we need to focus on, not just the cliff effect piece, which hugely important, and I know that you all are big advocates for, but just fundamentally childcare as a whole. So that's a little bit about me and the stuff that I'm super passionate about. Amy mentioned, of course, that I have twins, Emma and Henry. I was really fortunate to stay home with them, and how I actually then had the opportunity to work with Amy and Craig to do their bill tracking because I was working from home. And yeah, they're now in 4th grade. They just turned 10. We just celebrated their birthday in Disney World. So I have to say I have now peaked as a parent, and apparently there can't be anything more exciting. So that's unfortunate for them. But I'm really excited to be here and just look forward to taking questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. That's funny because I told my husband that the trauma that I'm going to put my kids through is the fact that I'm never going to take them to Disney World, so or Disneyland. I'm trying to stay away from that to make sure we don't have feedback. But I also wanted to mention that, kind of funny, you probably didn't hear this when they were first coming up here, but they were making deals up here. So Heather told Carrie that she'll work on the contraceptive coverage if she would work on the felon voter restoration. So they're working each other. Actually, both of them agree with both of those issues. So, just so I don't know if I mentioned it when we talked about earlier, but the governor's contraceptive coverage did pass the Senate, but has not passed the House. The felon voter restoration constitutional amendment passed overwhelmingly in the House, but hasn't passed the Senate. So we're appreciative that they got to do a little deal making while they're here. But anyway, let's go to questions. Does anybody in here, I'm going to go back to Mary Ray first, and then we'll go over here to Jean. Hold on just a second. There you go.
Thank you, Amy. Well, Heather, first of all, I would like to point out that you are a graduate of 50/50 in 2020, and we're very pleased to see that you've made it to the House. My question has to do with the philosophy of government in the state of Iowa. I am a strong supporter of home rule. I've always been very proud that Iowa was one of the first states to talk about home rule and the importance of it. But I see it in decline because of laws that are being offered and passed at the state capitol that are taking away from the power of our communities to establish what kind of taxation, what kind of programming that I feel is really vital to the Iowa personality. Can you tell me, please, what your thoughts are on home rule and how you would want to see the future of home rule in Iowa?
All right. That's a really great question. And I think it's a balancing act, honestly. One of the bills this last session that was the property tax bill. I had some serious problems with the bill because it was telling local cities basically how much they could essentially tax. And I know that some changes were made, as it made its way through the process and maybe got less bad, along the way. But for me, it was just kind of that fundamental principle of you're telling municipalities essentially how to run their cities. And so that was why I opposed that bill. I certainly appreciate and understand the concern about rising property taxes. I mean, I think, when people are in their homes and they feel like they're getting priced out of them, that's a concern, right? And I want to make sure that families, and really anyone for that matter, that they are economically secure. Economic security is why I ran for office. So, trying to find that balance, I think, is really important. But I want to make sure that the state isn't essentially directing municipalities on how to run their cities. That being said, I also want to make sure that as a state, we are, that we are a welcoming state, that we are a fair state. So if there are things that and I can't think of a specific example, but like if there is something that a city is doing that we might think is fundamentally not good for civil rights, or those bigger kind of like issue things, if we need to address that as a state, then we should. But I don't want to get into kind of like that micromanaging of how you essentially run your city. So that's kind of my philosophy of having as much local control and home rule as possible, but making sure that no one in our state is getting taken advantage of or being treated unfairly in the process.
And I voted in support of the tax bill. And I'll tell you why. And I work with my cities every day, and some of them were not happy, but I looked at my seat as I campaigned on to help lower taxes or keep them minimal. And that was something that I felt strong about. They can take out a higher levy, but the local people need to vote upon that. So I thought it went back to the vote of the people. We have to go on record taking our votes, and I think that it's smart that some of those elected officials back home have to go on record taking their votes for raising taxes, keeping the minimum, or increasing their levy. Property tax, unfortunately, is right now is what is taking the burden of mental health. And we all know that we cannot keep increasing property taxes to fund mental health at the need that it is. So I think we're going to have to look at how that is funded and take that off the burden of just the property taxpayers, and obviously invest more and look at how we tax that situation a little bit. I do think for us to keep people here, we have to have affordable housing, we have to have decent property taxes, and we have to have decent communities. And in our city's defenses, it's quality of life. They've got to provide the trails, and they've got to provide the wonderful things that are in their communities to make them shine. And if their communities vote for that, then increase your taxes.
Good morning. I believe, Heather, you mentioned something about daycare relative to a community that could lose industry. What kind of legislation is needed to support individual daycare providers or group daycare providers that comes from the state level so that, quote, every parent in Iowa has access to affordable daycare?
Sure.
It's an economic issue, I think, in addition to a safety issue for children.
Absolutely. That is a really great question and an incredibly important one. So there are a couple different issues here. I think it's really important to not only address the cliff effect side of things, in terms of an actual individual who is receiving child care assistance in order to be able, to send their kids to daycare. That needs to be addressed. But the other piece of that is reimbursement for providers. And I feel like this doesn't get enough attention. And if we think about it, I always use as a comparison healthcare, right? Because we all know about especially when we talk about Medicaid, right? We know that people who are providers who take Medicaid get reimbursed at a lower rate than private pay insurance. It's very similar to how child care assistance works. If you are a provider or, run a daycare essentially, and you take children whose parents are on child care assistance, then you are getting paid less than a family who is essentially paying out of pocket. And so what happens for so many providers of childcare across the state is that for them to be able to stay open, they either can't take families who are on child care assistance, or they have to limit that number and take more private pay in order essentially to be able to keep the lights on. And so what I think we need to be doing in the state is to raise that reimbursement rate for child care assistance to providers, so it makes it easier for them to be able to take more families who are on assistance. So that's one piece of it that I think the state needs to do. And that is also in partnership with the federal government. So I will tell you that issue is way more complicated than I thought it was going to be going into the first session. I thought I was like, oh my God, we just need to raise some reimbursement rates and we're good to go. No, apparently it is not that easy. And what I would also like to see, and this also requires more of a partnership with the federal government, is a sliding scale. So rather than just raising the income eligibility for child care assistance in general, rather than having that cliff, where you just suddenly you're making 10 cents more an hour and you lose everything, to be able to work your way down, right? So that you essentially get rid of a cliff regardless of what the level is. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is, and I think Carrie would probably agree with me on this because you were talking about public-private partnerships just in what you were doing with cities, is that is also, I think, what we need to do when it comes to childcare. And there are really great examples across the state of companies that have recognized the importance of having childcare available for their employees. In my district, Casey's is a great example. And I visited their corporate headquarters in Ankeny, and they have had an amazing childcare facility in their building for over 25 years because their founders recognized very early on that this is great for their employees, right? Number one, I mean, being able to have your kids close by is nice, but also it's just, it's easy, it's convenient, it's affordable, all of those pieces. And so what are the ways that the state can help local communities and smaller and businesses across the state to develop these partnerships? And understandably, there are a lot of businesses around the state that do not want to be in the business of childcare, right? Like they don't want to just suddenly be like, yeah, we now have this new industry happening in our company. It's really more about, okay, helping them build a partnership with childcare providers, right? So it might be that a company in, pick any town in the state, has a space that is big enough to also have a childcare facility, and then they kind of contract out with the people who are providing the care that are experts in that. So I think figuring out that a little bit more would be helpful. The Iowa Women's Foundation does a ton of work on this issue, and they have been working with businesses and communities across the state to help develop this further. So those would be the two things that I would like to see us work a lot harder on. Do you wanna...
I'm sorry, could you see the state subsidizing companies that want to enter into this partnership, or are we just going to say, gee, it'd be nice if you did that?
I think it's entirely possible that framed as a workforce issue, which it is, that we could get additional buy-in on that. I have noticed that there are plenty of issues in this state when they are just talked about from a pure education side of things. Or quality don't seem to make it as far. But when we talk about them in the context of workforce, it gets a little bit more attention. So it's true. So I think that that's possible. And finding those partnerships and then figuring out what that kind of incentive would be from the state is something that we need to continue to work on.
Well, we all know that affects quality of life because that's what we need. We want people to get out and work, they need affordable housing, they need quality daycare. And I hear a lot of people, I don't necessarily think it's wait lists at daycares too. I mean, it's showing an abundance of wait lists. And I think the workforce, for example, Greater Dubuque Development, it's one of their missions is to help with that. I serve on the Dyersville Community Foundation Board, and I will tell you what we did as an example. We actually own a daycare center. The Community Foundation saw the need in our community that to keep people in our community and to keep them working. So we actually run a center through our Community Foundation. It's been very successful. And we can manage it. We oversee it. We have a manager that oversees that, but the funneling is going from there because we know that our community is going to be slacking if that is ever missing. So I think that there's, once again, that's a perfect example of a private-public partnership that I think that they could model and utilize just to help some of these communities lift that out. Open.
I think someone told me recently that there's a community college that also has a child care facility that I think is also open to the community.
Northeast Iowa.
Oh, okay, great. Yes, I was like, someone told me this recently and now I can't remember what it is. So yeah, so I think that there are so many different ways that it can be done. I mean, my frustration in the last session was that so many people were talking about it. I mean, just as we were going into session, there was this constant talk about childcare and obviously addressing the cliff effect and, you know, and all of those pieces that I felt really good going into session that we were going to get something done. And what was so painful to me is that we couldn't even get a study bill passed out of the House, which is kind of crazy given that we don't even need a study bill. We know exactly what we need to do. But it was just such a, like, we can't even get this feel-good bill passed, right, to acknowledge that this stuff needs to happen. And so, yeah, that's got a lot of work to do, sadly.
Okay, I'm going to Doris, then Mary, then Karen, and then, okay. So I should have asked you to do this, but Mary Ray's from Dubuque and Jean's from Ottumwa. If you'd introduce yourself and which league you're from so they kind of have perspective.
My name is Doris Kelly, and I'm from the Waterloo Cedar Falls area. My question is, in the last 4 years, the amount of money we have spent for sexual harassment, and I know you talk about property taxes, local property taxes, worrying about that. I'm worried about taxpayers paying for all of these sexual harassment. Could you share with me how much we have spent in the last 4 years? And tell me what you are doing as a legislator to try to stop this. Because it's not only occurring in the departments, it's also occurring in the House and the Senate too. As a former state representative, I saw it myself. And I'd really like to know what's being done to stop it, because I think we're all getting tired of paying out the amount of money we're paying out for these sexual harassment cases. Okay?
Do you know the number, Amy? Craig, do you know the number that?
I'll look it up here.
It's extreme high. It's more, yeah. Yeah, it's obviously just coming in. We had to take training, extensive training, multiple trainings that we were required to do, as well as our staff and our clerks and all that. Not that that's an answer, but I think it's a step in the right direction. I mean, I won't tolerate it. And I think a lot of people feel that way. But in regards to how it's been spending, yeah, they're going to have to, I think they're going to definitely have to crack down on that. And that's going to have to go back to, I think there's some policies, isn't there, that they talked about doing? She may know more about the policy movement of it.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this, Doris, because it's awful. I mean, it's just what has been happening and happening for a very long time in the state. I mean, because also, I mean, if we're honest, I mean, it happens literally everywhere, right? And we as women leaders, are the ones that are really pushing, I think, to make sure that this nonsense comes to an end. I think what's so tough about how it gets paid out is that just legally, because the lawsuits are against the state of Iowa, right, not against the individual members or people who have committed sexual harassment, it is therefore legally the obligation of the state of Iowa to pay for it. So in some ways, it's almost like you know, should the people who are rightfully suing be suing individuals as opposed to the state of Iowa if you want to make sure that the state of Iowa is not who is paying for it? I mean, just legally thinking, you know, that through. I don't know the answer to that. I'm just putting that out there in terms of just legally, this is how it works, right? And I know that there have been suggestions of, you know, policy to say, you know, if it's, you know, comes out of, you know, a particular caucus staff or a member, then, you know, the party committee has to pay for it. You know what I mean? Like just kind of thinking through other ways to have to pay for it. But that's kind of where I think things are right now.
As you look at this, go back when IFA, when you go back in IFA, he was fired. It got swept under the rug, but yet the Des Moines Register pushed and pushed and pushed. I'm asking both of you, when these things happen, dig a little deeper, find out why, because we had to pay out a lot of money for that too. But why was it all of a sudden shoved under the rug and pretty well forgot about? And then we've got the Des Moines Register pushing and pushing. As representatives and senators and women, you need to really look and see what's going on.
Oh,
I'm asking you to do that.
Thank you. And I absolutely agree. And, I can't speak for every member, but I know certainly when it was happening with IFA, there were a couple of my colleagues who made very impassioned speeches on the floor of the House as points of personal privilege to talk about the issue. And so I think, we need to do everything we can to make sure that things aren't swept under the rug, right? And that with the craziness of every news cycle, that, not just in the state of Iowa, just crazy news cycles, that it's really easy to kind of forget what happened a few days or a few weeks before because there's just a new level of something to think about. So you're absolutely right. We need to just keep pushing forward.
So to answer that question, I'm just going to read the headline from a June newspaper report in the Register. $7 million so far, Iowa to pay $100,000 sexual harassment claim, its 7th settlement in 2019. So 7 settlements as of June, $7 million. And I will say that the Senate did hire a human resources person. I think the House might have one as well. I work for the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault as well. There was some changes to administrative rules that we felt didn't help as well after all of this. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done, not just legislatively, but also through the administrative rules process. But yeah, this is my 28th legislative session, Doris. I remember what it was like, and it's gotten much better, but still a lot to go. It's not an old boys club anymore. You can't just say the stuff it's not a locker room.
Oh, absolutely. And just to add on to that too, as norms are changing, thank God, right? To be able to just say, we're not going to put up with this crap anymore, quite frankly, right? This is, it's pervasive among the Capitol. And I'm sure, Doris, that you remember it just from when you were in the legislature. Yes, with the clerks, with lobbyists, with everyone. And there is, when you are in a workplace where there is a power dynamic from, and we talked about this with our training, right, with the human resources folks, right, from legislator to lobbyist, legislator to clerk, lobbyist to clerk. However you want to look at it, right? There's, we need to make sure as individual members that we do not allow anyone to be treated with disrespect in any way, whether that is sexual harassment, verbal harassment, bullying. I will only do this if you do this. None of that. It's unacceptable. And so anytime I hear that kind of thing, I'm going to crack down on it. But I know plenty of folks who work in the lobby that have a really tough time day to day because of treatment. And for me, that's unacceptable. So
I think we all can agree that, my name's Sue Wilson, I'm from Dubuque. We can agree that people should be punished. My question is logical. We don't ask IBM to pay for the discretions, the mistakes that an employee who has power to pay. We don't ask IBM to cover for the fine, let's say, the punishment. Why should the taxpayer pay or the government pay for an individual's mistake? That's my question for that.
I think it's who they're suing. So they actually sued the state of Iowa. They're not going after ABC name. They're suing the state.
Part of the issue is that, as I understand it, an employer is responsible for the behavior of their employees. And in this case, it is considered that the state is responsible for the people who are working there. So that's how it happens. And I do think that large corporations get sued for the same reason. We may not hear about it as much because they pay them off right away, but happen.
You have my next person on the question list. Did you want
Okay.
ask your question?
I actually have two questions. I will just ask the first one and we'll see about time for the second. This is a whiplash in terms of the kinds of issues that we've been talking about. But I want to bring up the second from the last thing on our list, which makes it just seem like sort of an afterthought, which I frankly think is the biggest issue before us right now. I believe what the scientists say, that we have about 11 years left to really make a difference in terms of, here it says climate change. I think it is properly addressed as climate emergency or climate crisis now. And that's fine if we adopt if we support adoption of state strategies. But frankly, I'm thinking the state ought to be out there thinking about what are we going to do? Just because we're in the middle of the continent and aren't facing rising waters doesn't mean that we're not facing what's happening with changes. Well, one of you mentioned changes in rainfall, for instance. What do you think the state legislature is thinking about doing? I know Senator Rob Hogue, that's one of his big issues. Is the Senate or the House or both of them likely to address this issue?
Well, I can tell you, as far as House Democrats go, last session, we had a bill, I think we filed it as an amendment, I'm trying to remember because it's a lot of stuff, that deals with climate. And it was essentially putting together a commission to deal with how we will protect our ag economy when it comes to climate change, and bringing stakeholders from a ton of different groups together from across the state to really address how climate change is fundamentally impacting our economy. And I realize that there are a lot of different ways we need to talk about climate change. This is just an example of one thing, but really recognizing that the devastating floods, the major changes in temperature. I was listening to public radio the other day, and they were talking about how far behind, different communities and different farmers are on getting their crops in, right? So, needing to do that is just one thing. We introduced it, didn't go anywhere. Obviously, we will keep pushing for that. But I do think that I agree with you that it is a crisis and something that we need to keep working on.
And I know the microphone's not here, but what concerns me is that agriculture, our farmers could be proactive. Agriculture could be a big part of actually addressing climate change. It's not just protecting agriculture.
No.
But, the idea that it takes so long for people to change the way they do things. Is there any hope that we can insist that there be no-till and other things that create carbon sequestration? What are the possibilities?
Well, and I think for that bill that I mentioned, it was also more than protecting. It was right. It was getting people to the table to talk about and do essentially all the different ways to make sure that we're addressing it. But I would certainly love to see more of an emphasis placed on soil conservation, water quality, and in all of those things. And I actually, Polk County Conservation has this really great event every year. It's called Glow Wild, and it's geared towards kids. But they had, quite frankly, one of the best demonstrations of what to explain runoff that I have ever seen, right? And they had this setup of kind of like this little town, and it was done by some folks from Iowa State, and then they had kids standing there, and like putting different things down, like if you're, doing this to your lawn here, and if you're not cleaning up your dog's messes here, you know, and all of this stuff. And then, so showing all of these different examples of, you know, things happening. And then they had all of the kids take these water bottles and just have this like massive rainstorm. And then it showed how all of this stuff is going into the river. And it was just the most clear explanation of, this is what happens when you don't take care of your soil and your community. And I just looked at the guy and I was like, thank you for giving me a really easy way to talk about how this actually works, right? So I think it's really important. There are so many great organizations around the state and so many farmers who are having these conversations with their neighbors about, you know, here I've started doing these no-till or low-till practices. I've started doing these buffer strips. I've started doing these cover crops. And here are the benefits that I can show you that I'm getting, right? Rather than someone just coming in like me from Des Moines who will just tell you straight up, I have never lived on a farm, so I'm not going to presume that I know how to farm, right? But I do understand, based on so many different conversations with folks, that essentially, you know, farmers are like their own small business, right? And if you are, I don't want to say struggling to make ends meet, but, you know, if you are living essentially like paycheck to paycheck or year to year, then it's tough to say, oh, hey, I'm going to be making these long-term investments, right, in cover crops and all of buffer strips and all of this stuff, if you don't feel really good that it's going to pay off, right? But if your neighbor is telling you, I've had this experience and it really works, that then helps. And so, so I want to make sure that the state is supporting those efforts to really help people work together and understand how we can actually, you know, actually all do this together, and that it shouldn't be a rural versus urban thing, but just an all Iowa thing.
We're fortunate in the Senate to have Senator Zumba chair our Agriculture Committee, which is where heavy conversations happen on this, and he's a farmer. So he, I think, gets it, but it's also going to have to work with the Natural Resources Committee. Have any of you toured the Iowa City Flood Center? It's an amazing thing, and we fund that program, I think, almost 100%. And they help explain all this and educate us as well as individuals on this. So I think it's an educational thing. And before we left session, don't quote me on this, we waited for the federal funding to come in for the communities that were flooded because we didn't know where their funds were going to come in. So we knew the state was going to have to kick in and help with some of those funds. And I think we allocated, was it 45 or 55 million before we left session, knowing that we would not have to call for a special session. So we would not have to go back down to Des Moines to approve that, because we knew our communities were struggling, and especially the legislators in their district, they would be gone from the Capitol or they would be in there. So we know it's something that we need to deal with. I do know I Will is something that looking at water quality. And so I think those are some funding pieces that they're going to have to puzzle together to help fund this mechanism.
I was just thinking about how funny it would be to have the Environmental Protection Committee and Natural Resources all be given water bottles and do that little model in their committee. All right, Karen's next, and then you, then Teresa.
Good morning. This is Karen Person. I'm with Metro Des Moines League of Women Voters. And, you know, we talked a lot about money and how we need money for community colleges and childcare and flood mitigation and all of those kinds of issues throughout Iowa. But, you know, I've been working on criminal justice reform for 20 years. Back in 1970, we had 2,200 people in our state correctional facilities. Now we have 8,500 people at our correctional facilities, even though our state has stayed relatively stable with population. Along with quadrupling our prison population, we've also quadrupled our cost for incarceration. And it seems to me like we don't want to raise, nobody wants to raise taxes, but when you have more and more money going to incarceration, you have less and less money for schools, libraries, childcare, flood mitigation, and all those needs. What can we do to better utilize our dollars in Iowa?
Oh, that's a lot of different answers that I'd love to shove your way or talk about. I was just at the prison actually down by Newton because we're doing the house building program there. So we're having the prisoners build affordable housing. And that was a model that we took from South Dakota, actually. We went out to visit that. And so it's a great system. And that's just an example of something that we can do with a partnership with those. I know we had to throw an extra 17 million in for public safety this year. And that's a lot of that. That's additional 17 million that we had to throw in this past year. So that's pretty excessive. So I think this kind of floods into mental illness as well, and education and all of that stuff. So hopefully when we can get a grasp and a handle on that, it's going to alleviate it a little bit. But it's probably not the perfect solution, but I think that those two go hand in hand together. And we're going to have to keep looking at how we are going to fund that. And obviously it's going to probably have to be an additional tax if we don't have the current funding to make sure that we mandate that so we don't put it on the property tax burden.
This is a big question and a really, really important one. So I'm really glad that you asked it. I wish that I had all the answers on this, but I think there are a bunch of different pieces here. One, mental health is a big piece. As fortunately as we've seen in some communities where they've expanded core services and you're seeing a better relationship between public safety and local police departments being able to kind of make sure that instead of sending someone to jail, they're getting them help. That's great, right? And that's definitely a good way to make sure that people don't go to prison that shouldn't be going to prison. That's one thing. We also need to recognize that there is just still bias in this state and in this country when it comes to sending people to jail. And until we're willing to acknowledge that, it's not going to change. And I think we need to have these very real and very hard conversations about how some people in our state are not treated the same as other people in the state. And yes, that is often people of color. So we have to keep having that conversation. And the other piece that I think we do need to talk about and tackle is bail bonds. I know it's not a sexy topic, and people are like, whatever, if you've done something wrong, then deal with it. But the thing is that this is an industry that is profiting off the backs primarily of people of color and primarily those who are poor. We make it very, very hard to be poor in this state and in this country.
We make it very expensive.
Yes, we make it very expensive too. And so if you think about it, if you have been arrested for something, whether you are guilty or innocent, you've just been arrested, you've been picked up for something. Let's say that you are actually innocent, right? And you're sent to jail and you do not have the resources to get yourself out. So you either have to sit in jail while you're waiting, right? And in the meantime, you're not taking care of your kids. You are losing your job, right? And you have done nothing wrong. I'm not saying this is everybody. I'm just using this as an example, right? So all of these things are happening. And in the meantime, you're also being made to pay all of these court fees when you were literally just picked up for something you didn't do, right? Or you do get a bond, you go to the bail bondsman, you pay some insane interest rate and, just to be able to get out, right? So there's that piece of things. But then I just have a fundamental problem with predatory practices. And this is one of those pieces that really concerns me. And so that's just something that we need to be talking about and we need to be addressing. And then also just within the system, I have friends that work in Polk County Jail. and they see how people are, especially mentally ill, which is a huge part of the population in jail, not receiving their medications, which then makes it worse. And so it's a compounding problem that we absolutely need to address.
Hi, my name is Raven from Davenport. I want to circle back around to the question Doris had asked about the sexual harassment settlements. And I don't know who up here said it, but you're absolutely right. When you are a victim of sexual harassment at work and you go to see an attorney about this, the attorney doesn't sue the individual, the attorney sues the company. And that's the way the laws are set up. Now, the difference between a legislator and a private company is that the private company is going to get hit with that lawsuit, and they are very likely to let the perpetrator of the harassment go. So they're not going to be a part of the company anymore. An elected official, you're not getting fired. So the state takes the hit, the legislator stays in power, and that's how a lot of it gets swept under the rug, because what can you do? What can you say? So one solution may be some kind of punitive action in code for the legislators that cause these settlements to come about. And also with the bail bonds, I would be curious to hear, I worked in criminal defense. I'm not an attorney, I'm a paralegal, but worked with criminal defense attorneys for a really long time. And I saw up close and personal the bail bonds issues. By the time you get out of jail, if you're innocent, or if you end up taking a plea deal and pleading to a lesser crime, by the time you get out of jail, a lot of people have lost custody of their kids, their car has been repossessed, their apartment they've been evicted from their apartment, and there's no recourse for them to recover any of those things. What are some ideas that you have about how to equalize that a little bit? One thing that I've seen work in my community in Davenport is that they have a drug court. So so you get picked up with, say, some marijuana in your pocket. Rather than go to jail, you're diverted into the drug program. You go through basically a treatment program. There's a prosecutor and a judge who are specifically assigned to see you through the program. Something like that would lower the cost of incarceration, because these people are not incarcerated, but those programs don't exist everywhere. So what are some solutions we could work on locally to equalize that playing field?
So I'm glad that you brought up the drug court. I fully support that. And so I would like to see stuff like that happening around the state. And maybe Amy and Craig, maybe Carrie, you would know. I'm trying to remember, there was, and I can't remember who was specifically the drug court, but there was something happening. Weren't Polk County courts doing something similar with trying to divert people out of jail? Jail diversion, thank you. I was like, I swear to God, I was just hearing about this. So, but yes, there were, because it was happening in other parts of the state, and seeing success with these programs, doing more of it in Polk County. And it is my understanding that there are members of the legislature who made sure that it was in code that we cannot do that. And that's ridiculous. Correct. Am I getting that right? I don't want to be speaking out of turn. I think, yeah. But there's something that that the funding wasn't there, or there's some kind of component that was put in to code, or it was not funded.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the core services, some of the jail diversion didn't qualify for core services. I think there was, I'm trying to remember now too, my brain's a little cloudy because I forget things after session and then I have to go back and remember them. But there was something that it depended on what you were being charged with. There was something that they decided couldn't be used for jail diversion. Like I know for one instance with Polk County, the sobering unit that they're putting in the jail is not allowed as a part of the mental health coverage. But, it's Medicaid coverage, yeah. And so the jail's picking up that cost, even though it's connected and intertwined with the mental health region. And that's where I think one of you had mentioned there's a lot more collaboration now going on with the public safety side and the mental health side, disability, behavioral health side of things. with that, but it kind of just depends on the type of service that you're talking about. I know that a really big part of the jail diversion in Polk County was because there's a lot of people that need the sobering unit, and then even before they can get moved into other parts of the jail diversion or to a drug court or a mental health court or something like that. That also made me think of, when you brought up drug courts, that we better make sure they're funded well next year, because Illinois, January 1 is going to legalize recreational marijuana. So I'm guessing over in your side of the state, there's going to be a lot of issues that are brought up. Teresa? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm understanding that the CBD pop-ups, which apparently are showing up in family videos around the state because video sales aren't doing well, they're like selling illegal, you can't verify the content of the CBD.
I get mailings about them at home. So I mean, like literally like from, could be, oh, we sell blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't think you're one of the dispensaries. So yeah.
I also understand that maybe there might be something in the Senate coming up about hemp, because in other states that have legalized hemp, people that are being picked up with marijuana are just saying it's hemp, and then it's too costly to do the labs on these. So they're just stopped, like Kentucky has just stopped issuing tickets on it. So I think there might be something coming up in the Senate relating to that piece.
I just met with the state drug department and the Iowa State Troopers this week, and they were talking about how that is going to be a huge concern, just because dogs are trained, and the hemp, the dog is trained to recognize that. They do not differentiate the difference of that. So we're going to have to go back to how that, and he said he did not think that they could be retrained. So with us up and down on the eastern Iowa border, it's going to be a huge concern for our entryway, especially in eastern Iowa. All those communities, the state patrols, our cities, they're going to have to really ramp up on that, so we make sure that is, and that's going to require funding.
Hey, Teresa, you're next.
Well, I could talk to you all day about some subjects, but the one I'm going to talk to you about is insurance, because we've talked about how it is impactful to the state budget for criminal justice and mental health needing more money. And my plea is that we somehow work with private insurance so they pay their fair share. Because right now, a lot of the programs that we have rely almost totally on government funding. And what I mean with private insurance is they have, for instance, skinny plans out now where they really don't pay for anything, and people are ending up with surprise bills where, you know, they thought they had coverage and they really don't. There's Maine has a law that protects the citizens of Maine by making sure that all insurance products cover the essential health benefits, whether the ACA stays or whether it goes, because they know how important those essential benefits are. We don't have anything like that. Then you take a look at the provider networks of insurance companies. What I find absolutely incredible is that we have a critical shortage of workforce, critical in mental health especially. But yet you go to any insurance company and you look at our rules, and they all say that they have adequate provider networks. So how can those two situations sit side by side? So what we're asking for is to have provider network rules changed. We did a study back in 2014, and we found people being listed on provider networks of insurance companies up to 25 times because of the way they have the rules set up. And the feds don't want to call the, right now the provider rules are all around geographical coverage, but still, you know, one provider is still only one provider. And what the provider network rules show us now is that one provider is not one provider. Actually, they're 10 or they're 15. So that's one thing. The other thing that also the Iowa Medical Association has talked about and wanted, which we've also wanted, is a single credentialing center Right now, when any provider wants to get reimbursed, first they have to go to Medicaid and get credentialed there, and that can take anywhere from 90 to 100 days after they've been hired. They can't see anybody or they can't be reimbursed for that. And then after they get credentialed by Medicaid, then they can go to all the other providers. But with every insurance provider, they have to go through the same process. They still have to be credentialed. And so what we've created is a vast diversion of time when they can't work with patients, delay in getting payment, an increase in administrative costs because they have to keep track of how far they are in this whole credentialing process. And it just diverts the thing that the providers should be working on. And the fourth thing is parity. Right now, Iowa has an F as far as mental health parity laws are concerned. And I just read a report by Milliman, and Milliman does a lot of reports regarding insurance for the state of Iowa. And they finally come up with a way that instead of having a complainant like me file a lawsuit against an insurance company and have to try to prove that they didn't meet parity standards, what it does, instead of having it go that way, have insurance companies instead provide proof that they meet mental health parity standards by giving them a formula that they have to follow and report. And once again, I can send you a bunch of stuff on this, but it's very apparent that they deny behavioral health coverage at a higher rate than other medical and surgical specialties. They also pay behavioral health providers less than providers in other specialties. They have higher pre-authorization standards. So, and it seems like nobody wants to touch private insurance to be a fair payer to try to support the system. Because we've tried to put through insurance bills before, and they just went nowhere. And reserves that you could possibly imagine, financial reserves. So, this is a huge problem that nobody wants to tackle. I'm asking you to do that. Because, for instance, with the credentialing center, you could save people a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, this is a huge issue. And Teresa, you and I have talked about mental health a ton, and healthcare as a whole. And I know Amy mentioned my husband's a physician at Broadlawns, our county hospital. He's a family doctor, and healthcare is a passion of mine. So for him, it's as a provider. For me, it's from the policy side of things. So, I feel like I see it all in a lot of different ways. And just a couple of thoughts here. Well, first of all, a lot of the stuff that you were saying, were you thinking of it more from like the Medicaid and MCO side of things, or just talking about how things are paid for and paperwork as a whole? Yep. Yep. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, because what I hear, especially from the MCO Medicaid side of things, numerous providers, including folks like On With Life that does, traumatic brain injury, which is in my district, they and so many others have had to hire people just to do the paperwork, right? That's crazy, right? And especially when these are, community health centers or nonprofit healthcare providers that have to spend every dollar, right, so thoughtfully on how they provide care. And when they have to hire additional people just to do paperwork, and with the constant changes that have been happening with this MCO's in, this MCO's out, changing, who each patient, or who the Iowan has as a provider, as their insurance. And then you've got different rules. And is my provider still in their network or not? That constant shifting is just increasing costs so much. Never mind the turmoil, right, that it's putting individual Iowans through. So that has to be addressed. And certainly the amount of paperwork that providers themselves have to do now, and now jumping through additional hoops of, how things used to be covered when it was under the state of Iowa. And I'm not saying it was perfect when it was just regular IME by any means. Things can always be improved, but things that were covered before that aren't covered now, things, medications that, they used to be able to do, but now have to go through hoops to just be able to get what your doctor says you need. Talk about not wanting to get between, not wanting government to get between, the patient and the doctor. For crying out loud, that is exactly what they're doing. So I want to make sure that patients and doctors together can make the decisions that work best for that individual patient. We are struggling, absolutely, in that regard. And I see that with so many friends, especially with friends who have children with mental health needs. That is a big struggle for them. You mentioned the skinny plans. That is something that I have a huge problem with, major concerns, especially what we have right now in the state of Iowa, that one option that is not even legally allowed to be called health insurance because it provides no protections. And I think there are too many folks who are, because they are struggling and face major economic insecurity, pick up these plans because they think it's better than nothing. And then something happens and they have no recourse whatsoever. And I find that unacceptable. And I think it's bad business practice. And I think it's bad governance that has been allowed to happen in this state. And so I think we do need to work on ways to make sure that insurance companies, if we're going to have private insurance in this state and in this country, then they need to be accountable to more than just their shareholders. They need to be accountable to their customers. And because healthcare is not a privilege, it is a right. It is a human right. And we need to make sure that everyone is taken care of in this state, whether it is physical health or mental health. And I hear you on the parity.
I was going to actually ask a follow-up to Senator Kelker, because you sit on Commerce, which would look at insurance mandates, if you want to call them that. We'll just call them that, because that's what they're called. But what advice would you give people that want to do something related to requiring something of insurance? What kind of standards do you look at when you're being presented with a plan? I think the last one we did was maybe autism coverage, and that took probably 6 years to get done before you were there. What advice do you give people that want to pursue something related to insurance when they're coming to you and showing you something?
It's one of the toughest things, to be honest, that you deal with right now as an elected official. We know the system is not perfect. We know that the system we had before this was not perfect. But we have to increase our Medicaid. We increased over 9 digits this year, just this year. So we're talking $100 to $200 million a year that this is climbing the state of Iowa. And what is that crowding out insurance for? It's crowding out education budgets, all these other things that we talked about today. So some way we need to find out how the crowding is. And I'll tell you, when I meet with my constituents, it's the one-on-one interaction. You hear their story or your friend's story. Like she said, I've got families and friends that are struggling with this very issue as well. Mental health. I have 2 that live above me in my office in Dyersville. And so they're caregivers. Those type of people are not used to that type of change. So we need to make sure we're helping Iowans' most vulnerable people. And let's face it, every system does get utilized and damaged as well. So there's people that probably are utilizing the system to their advantage if they could be out working. but we need to make sure that we clarify who those most vulnerable people are so we can make sure that we continue to better the system.
Yeah, I will say that this is also a federal issue, of course, and because our current bill tracker, the one that came after Heather, is now living in Idaho because, well, she's got family there, but she could not find a health plan that was affordable on the insurance exchange to buy. It was so much. Out in Idaho, she has 6 choices, all of which were $300 or $400 a month versus the $8,000 to $1,000 here for a single woman about my age. So this crosses many jurisdictional borders. We only have time probably for one more question. I'm sorry about that, but I'm going to go here, and then if it's a quick one, we'll get to another one.
Hi, my name is Paula Vaughn. I'm from Johnson County. My question relates to affordable housing. I know that there have been companies coming into the state purchasing mobile home parks, raising rent, and therefore kicking those people out of their homes. They have very little legal recourse, like none. There is nothing so far that can be done for these people. So they are losing their homes. They live there because it's much more affordable than any other place called affordable. So what do you see the legislature doing about this? What do you think will be happening?
Sure, I can tackle that because we've been dealing with it in Dubuque, and I've been working with Senator Wall. Actually, Senator Walls just emailed me this week, but we've been working directly with a company that this is happening in Dubuque. And so it's pretty much crowding it out. We did pass a bill in the Senate this year, and I think it died in the House. So I think what we're going to do is make sure that that bill is still alive and active. We flowed it through our committee and it passed the Senate, and now we'll make sure that we deal with the House people, but something has to be done. And those people, the trickle-down effect of it, those people are working at our fast food industries and our malls and all those type of people. So we need to make sure that they stay here because we're already seeing a low unemployment rate, and we're also wanting them to get out and work. So that is being looked at heavily by, I know, a group of 4 senators that are extremely looking at that right now. They're actually having a meeting coming up November 5th. I know it's not the perfect answer for you, but I do know that it is. Yeah. There was a bill this past year in the Senate, on the Senate floor about it.
And I would just add that I completely agree. I'm glad you brought it up. It's critically important. And I know that there are other members too who are very focused on this issue. I know Representative Lindsey James has been at like every single thing happening in Dubuque to talk about this. It's amazing. But this also just comes back to how we are treating our neighbors, right? This is about ensuring that everyone is safe in their home, that everyone can have the tools that they need to get ahead. And if you can't even afford to live in your home, or if you are being kicked out by people who are coming in and taking over, then that is just a fundamental problem that we need to be addressing as a state.
Okay, now is the last one. So you didn't really get to ask a question on the other time that you spoke, so I'll let you be the last one. And I'm sure that these fine legislators wouldn't mind responding to you. If you do have a question to follow up, if you emailed them, I'm sure that they would answer. Or if you catch them before they leave, they're welcome to join us for lunch too. But I know being a parent of kids is crazy this time of year.
Hi, I'm Sue Wilson from Dubuque. I had a question from, I think, 3 issues ago. It was about the criminal justice question. When a court, or I'm not even sure if it's the court, assigns a bail, do they take into consideration whether the offense was violent or not? If it is violent, I think that would be an easy demarcation line to weed those people out because they shouldn't be on the streets and they should be incarcerated whether or not they have bail, in my opinion. But then you're assigning guilt already before they're heard. Mm-hmm. So it's a tricky issue, but I think the issue of whether they're violent or not, they should have different rules, but I don't know the law very well. Does anyone have it?
Well, I can't say that I know the law very well because it's been 20 years since I was county attorney. But in defense of the court system, there is a list of things that the judge must consider. And actually, in this state, you have to come before the court within 24 hours of the time you are arrested, which is very good. I mean, in some countries and in some states, it's much longer than that. When the judge decides whether you qualify for release on your own recognizance, ROR, they take into account many things, but a lot of them are the things that Representative Watson mentioned. What the court is looking at is how likely are they to appear when they are called to court again? And one of the things would be, how long have you lived in this community? Do you have a stable family situation? So it's the kinds of things that people who are poor and very transient are likely not to be able to qualify for. So it's sort of a catch-22 situation. It's not like they don't look at these things, but the things that they are looking at to see whether this person is going to appear are not the kinds of things that are likely to make it possible for poor people to qualify for release on recognizance.
Well, Raven had her hand up, but Doris, a long time ago, you had a question. Are you good? Somebody that hasn't asked a question? Oh, Myrna. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm hurrying.
Nobody said go Hawks. I wore this.
All right, I just want to let folks know that one of the things we've been talking about is the criminal justice system, and we've been talking about poor folks and, that kind of thing. And we know that people of color and poor people are greatly overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So one of the things your criminal justice committee is doing is working very hard on restoration of voting rights. And we have some materials about that for you here today. When you go to lunch, you might want to look at them. Actually, Craig is standing right there to help us find them. He may move, but anyway, there's a little card that tells you what our current law is, and you really should read that card because it will make your head spin. Do it before you eat, I think. And there are some, I didn't have enough copies for everybody. There are some, so maybe one per league or something, a sheet of 11 reasons to support restoration of voting rights. So maybe that's one way of moving toward a little less bias and maybe a little lower cost for our system.
Thanks. And before I mentioned that Karen was the chair of that committee, I'm sorry, Myrna has been the chair of that committee for the last year. I apologize, but they've both done a great job. So, Raven, did you have another one that you wanted to ask? No? Okay. Anybody else? We've got like a minute. Okay.
Sure. Oh, sorry. Carrie, I met you at See Yourself Here this past year, as did Therese, because you came and talked to our people with 50 and 20. We met you when you came in and out because you were going to the floor to participate in votes to show our young people, young women who are interested in going into politics. So thank you for that. And maybe we'll see you sometime, Heather, in the future.
I popped by, but it was for like 5 minutes.
Maybe I was talking to Ed Cook and the Legislative Service Bureau at that time. I'm Linda Malloy, and I'm on the State League. The National League has started an initiative called People Powered Fair Maps, and it's to help all the leagues in the nation with some financing support, which is good, to address gerrymandering in their states. And we are very fortunate in Iowa that our reapportionment process is probably the best in the nation and is admired across the country. And Amy told us that through her avenues of information, as well as Therese visiting with some individuals at the State House, that our reapportionment process is sound and that probably nobody's going to be making attempts to change the statutory part of it. I'd like to know your take on that.
And also, if we don't have to spend the little bit of money that we're getting from the National League on our changing our process or getting it better, how would you spend that money? It's not a whole lot. I mean, it's not a whole lot, but it's a little bit.
How much
It's
is it?
like how much? It's a little bit. It's a little bit. And we can also deal with the census. That money can also be used for the census as well, because the census, of course, is the basis for any attempts to redistrict or for reapportionment. So.
Yeah, and I actually found out that Iowa does not appropriate money usually for the census. It's all done pretty much locally. Other states have appropriated money, but I actually asked our legislative service agency about that when we started this, and it was kind of interesting that I think the most we ever spent was like $20,000. So, I mean, it's an interesting that the state does not allocate those funds for that, but
And I've just found out recently that the state of Iowa does not have a certified count committee. The state does not. It's up to cities, counties to do this work. So, and in fact, I think it was, I was told that I was one of the very few that does not have its own certified count committee. We're not, yeah.
I think we're both being educated up here, to be honest.
Well, so I'm glad that you brought up this topic because gerrymandering is one of the worst things that has happened to our politics over the last few decades. It has led to increased polarization. It's led to the creation of both congressional districts and legislative districts, certainly in other parts of the country, because like you said, we have an awesome process here, but it has led to the creation of districts that are either so far to the right or so far to the left that the people who represent them or who are seeking to represent them go to the furthest fringe to obviously win those voters. And it makes it even less likely to find compromise because everyone's just kind of talking to their base instead of actually having conversations with everybody. I mean, we've seen it play out. It is a fact, right? So there's that. I love Iowa's system. It is incredibly important to me that we keep this system. I have heard over and over again that there is no intention to change that. I am going to take folks at their word when they say that they have no intention of changing it. That being said, this is so important that I think it's incredibly important to remain vigilant on the topic and to make sure that all of our elected officials are being held accountable on this issue, because the last thing that we want as a country when we are unfortunately so divided, the last thing that we need is to make it worse here. And I do not want to go down that path. It is already hard enough, right? And so my hope is that we will have a session that is our next session that is productive, that we pass bills that actually help everyday Iowans get ahead and leave that stuff at the door.
I think I touched base on that a little bit in my opening comments. The party lines are extreme. And I think it's been educational to look at that. And I think that they're not extreme with everyone. I honestly think that, there's some that, I think we both probably have voted both sides of the aisle this year. So
and I think for most, and I don't think it's as much of a problem here as it is in other parts of the country, but still.
And truly, it comes down to respect too. The voters have voted. Let's respect it and not, get through the next one. And election day, we'll roll around again and again and again. And that's where can be voted out if you're not doing your job and, your people don't. Now, I will tell you, I'm in a pretty split district. I'll use my district, for example. It actually probably leans a little bit, maybe way to the left a little bit, but there's a big independent audience, but it's a very rural district. So, and speaking of that, which goes to campaigning, I mean, you look at what everyone's spending on campaign funds, and it's sad. And and half of our job is going out and raising money so we can campaign. And I look at my Senate seat, it was very competitive. And so it's truly, there's probably a lot of great people that would run for office if they didn't have to go through the brutal ride.
Yep, and just, you weren't here when I mentioned that Teresa had communications with Senator Schneider and his office, and he is on the record supporting redistricting. So we're hoping that, no change.
No change.
Yes,
right.
yes, sorry.
Yeah, I've talked to Schneider too. Yeah,
Well, I want to thank our panel. This has been great. I really appreciate them taking a busy Saturday off to come and speak with us, but this has been, I think, one of the best issues briefings we've had. So I really appreciate them here.